Over the past couple of decades, the landscape of work in Canada and the world has changed dramatically. Contingent work has become far more common and has led to many abusive practices and exploitation. Contingent work includes gig workers like musicians and DoorDash drivers, but also medical residents, temporary foreign workers, and in-home caregivers. We're in a situation where we're not going to put the genie back in the bottle and return to stable 40-hour workweek jobs with good pay. So what can we do? I'm Eric Bowman, I'm the Communications Specialist at the Canadian Psychological Association, and this is Mindful. Contingent workers, no matter what sector they work in or what job they do, are more reluctant to report abusive practices and therefore more vulnerable to being exploited and abused. For a long time, it was thought, or maybe assumed, that the types of abuse faced by contingent workers were primarily psychological, and that companies would have plans in place to protect workers. My guest today says that not only are the abuses far more widespread and take many different forms than just psychological, she also says the plans to protect workers don't go quite so far as we assume or would hope that they do.
I'm Catherine Connelly. I'm a professor at the DeGroote School of Business at McMaster University, and I'm the director of McCrew. It's the McMaster Center for Research on Employment and Work.
And we're going to talk about contingent workers today, and I'm hoping you can give me a definition of contingent workers. I feel like gig workers is a subset of contingent workers, but we use gig workers as a sort of overall, as a term that everyone understands in a way. So what is a contingent worker versus a gig worker?
Yeah, so you're exactly right. Contingent worker is the broader category, and it encompasses everybody who has some degree of precarity in their work. So most of us have some job insecurity, but we don't have a definite end date for when our work ends. And contingent workers have, for the most part, an end date in mind. So your gig workers, they have very short. And at the end of that Uber ride, that's the end of that. And then they move on to the next client. Same with temp agency workers. They're contingent workers too, because they have a contract with the temp agency with no expectation that this continues indefinitely. And then temporary foreign workers would be another example, because they have typically a 2-year contract. That's the end. And then at the end of that, they could have a new contract, but more likely they would move on to something different.
Okay. And how has the landscape for people doing contingent work changed in the last decade or even the last few years, maybe since COVID?
Oh gosh, yeah. So I've been studying this since about 2004. So at the time, like when I started looking at this, temps were the big thing, right? And so temps and contractors. And this was a bit of people were kind of wringing their hands a little bit of it, like, is this the end of work as we know it? And people were talking about how there's no more loyalty of employers to workers. And this is the end of the 40-day work week or the 40-hour work week. Like, people were a little concerned about how things were going. And then it just kind of got much worse.
Right. Yes. Was the idea at that time that employers were hiring temp workers because it was cheaper and easier for them, and that would be the way that things go, and that no one would have full-time employment anymore? Was that the basic idea?
Yeah, exactly. People were concerned about companies hiring part-time workers, 2 part-time workers instead of 1 full-time worker, that you couldn't support a family anymore because you had this patchwork of different things that you were stitching together to make enough of an income to support yourself. And people were concerned because it was such a contrast to what people had thought about previously. I guess even just in the 90s, about you would have a career position and you would have maybe not just one employer in your entire life, but certainly long periods of employment with the same company. And then it just went sideways after that. And so, we had a huge upswing in the number of part-time workers, much heavier reliance on temp workers, so not just agencies, but also people hired directly. And then as the technology shifted, then we started seeing a greater preponderance of platform workers. And so those would be people who get gigs through a platform. So something like Fiverr or TaskRabbit or Uber, all those different Rover, all those different platforms where people find shorter and shorter contracts.
Right, right. And was that becoming a much bigger thing? I sort of think, I feel like I really started paying attention to that stuff and noticing it a lot more during COVID when we relied so heavily on those gig workers, the Uber Eats people, the skip the dishes people, the one, I don't remember the name of the one that goes to get groceries for you, but that kind of worker that we relied so heavily on them. Was that becoming a thing before COVID and just accelerated during the pandemic and the lockdowns? Or was that really the start of that becoming a huge industry?
Yeah, so they definitely existed beforehand, but they really became more visible during COVID because we had such an immediate work from home. And these people like Instacart, I think, were
Yes, right.
They were way more visible than they had been before. And so they existed previously, but suddenly they were the ones who were taking the risks of interacting with more people while everybody else was at home because of the lockdowns.
And one of the things that I saw in your presentation that you gave at our convention was something that I think I intrinsically believed to be the case, but didn't know for sure, which is that some people, for example, taxi drivers who had a stable industry for the longest time, and then Uber and Lyft and other ride shares came along, and now they are no longer working as a taxi driver, they're working as an Uber driver, and they've made that shift. And I'm wondering, is that sort of unique to that situation, or are a lot of jobs that once existed now becoming platformed in the way that, back in 2004, it was temp workers sort of taking the place of full-time workers with benefits and so on?
Yeah, so the interesting thing about platforms and platform work or gig work is that it really facilitates this idea of a side hustle. And so there were some barriers to entry before. If you wanted to, say, be a cat sitter or a dog walker or a taxi driver, like you'd have to get into that industry somehow and either find someone to work for directly or take over somebody else's medallion on their taxi, or you had to find a way kind of into that. Maybe make a website, like find clients. There's a little bit of work involved with that. With the platforms, it just became a lot easier to sort of take that up, and usually on the side. So the interesting thing about the taxi drivers is some moved over from taxi to Uber, but even more of them started doing taxi and Uber.
Right.
And yeah, and same with a lot of other industries. So if you need extra income, it's usually on the side, not necessarily as a full replacement for what you were doing before. And
yeah.
Interestingly, we found that it was those workers who had the hardest time, because not only are they trying to do this job, this source of income, they're trying to do this other job, and sometimes a third job on top of that. So it's like you've got your day job, you've got your side hustle, then there's this other thing you're doing at the same time. It doesn't end, and then people are just pulled in so many directions.
And so when you talk about people having a hard time, I'm wondering if you can sort of illustrate to me what that looks like. I'm imagining that burnout is a big part of it. If you have, multiple things happening at the same time and you're trying to keep up with it and you're trying to make sure that you can earn enough to make a living for your family, that burnout would be a part of it. But there must be more to it than that, right?
Yeah, so the burnout is real. The thing is, people assume that, they don't have all their eggs in one basket. They've got different streams of income, so that must feel better, right? Because if this doesn't work out, don't worry, you've got these others. But in practice, what happens is people start worrying about every stream, because they are maxed out. And so if any of their 5 jobs
Right.
runs into trouble, then they're at risk. So they don't just have one thing to worry about; they've got several things to worry about. And so the precariousness, it's this added level of worry for them.
Right. And I mean, what sort of outcomes does that lead to? What are people dealing with that maybe wouldn't be if they didn't have this precarious series of streams of income?
Oh yeah. So I mean, this is your burnout. This is your psychological distress. This is physical distress. This is people having trouble sleeping. This is people not just having to deal with things like work-life balance, but it's work balance, where
Right.
you're trying to juggle all these extra things. So it's so many extra stressors, but no extra resources, right? So you have all these demands on you, but yeah, maybe there's a little bit of extra income. These are not typically intrinsically rewarding jobs. So it's not that it's necessarily helping you psychologically to have so much going on, but it is lots of competing demands, and just the amount of time that people are spending working means there's less time for recovery, relaxation, and other things that you would normally do to try to counteract some of the burnout.
And I was surprised to see, and I guess I had never thought of it this way, that there are a lot of medical jobs that are contingent jobs that, and I guess I think of medical jobs as something that is intrinsically rewarding. You're saving lives, you're helping people in a myriad of ways. But I've never thought of it as contingent work before. But you point out that, yeah, there's a lot of contingent work in the medical field.
Oh, absolutely. Right. So people often think about nurses, for example, with this ridiculous shift work and these very long shifts. That is definitely a really intense job, rewarding, but also very demanding. But the research I've done is on medical residents, and these also have a rough time of it. And so they're working long shifts. They're in rotation. And so they might have a few weeks in oncology, a few weeks in pediatrics, a few weeks in nephrology, and they are basically going from specialty to specialty, trying to impress the right people, trying to learn as much as they can. But it has an end date, right? And so at the end of their rotations, they will hope to complete everything well, and then they will try to secure permanent employment. But in the meantime, even though it's a very well-respected profession, even though they're, at the top of their field in terms of education and prestige and all those things, it's still very precarious. And so much for them rides on the good opinion of their supervisor, basically. So it is all kind of riding on, can you stay on this person's good side?
Right. As they have dramatized many times on Grey's Anatomy,
Yeah.
which is the only way I'm familiar with any of that at all, is,
Yeah.
and is it getting worse? Not just for people in the medical profession, but just people in contingent jobs overall. Is it continually getting worse, or are we finding ways to help these people to make things more manageable?
Yeah, so I'd say the one upside is there's less stigma associated with having a job that's more in the gig economy or that's not permanent and continuing. I think because it's become so common, I think there's a greater understanding that this is just how things work these days. And so if somebody were maybe working in platform economy for a while and then trying to switch into permanent employment, having that on the resume would not be stigmatized, I would say, compared to maybe previously. It might have been like, well, why couldn't you get something permanent sooner? That said, there are many people who are doing these types of jobs and it's not their preference. So for some, it would be that this is actually what they would have wanted to do because they like the ability to start and stop work as they need to, or maybe it's post-retirement, or maybe they have a spouse with a very stable income and benefits. So there are some people who would prefer this. But for many people, it is not the preference at all. And it's just a stopgap until something better becomes available to them. And so I would say, just with the large numbers of people who are taking on these types of roles, I'd say in general, that's not better. I'd say things are kind of deteriorating a little bit in this regard.
Yeah, and you mentioned that there's less stigma about it now, I think, because we understand it better and because I think we all understand how difficult things are for young people right now compared to when we were young, or certainly compared to when our parents were young. But I'm wondering about one particular group of workers, and in terms of stigma, I don't think there are too many workers in the world who are experiencing the kind of stigma that temporary foreign workers are experiencing right now in the wake of COVID and with everything that's going on in the US, and some of that, comes over here too. I'm wondering if you can sort of give me a snapshot of what life is like for a temporary foreign worker in Canada right now.
Yeah, so that's it's hard to summarize
Yeah.
too succinctly, but I would say many workers come to Canada because they think it will be safe, that they think they will be treated fairly, and they have lots of experience and skills that they would like to put to good use. And for some people, it works out great as intended. And for a sizable minority of temporary foreign workers, things are not at all what they expected. And they endure a lot of mistreatment. And they are scared to complain because they're worried about retaliation. And so they just suffer until they can find either a path to permanent residence or they go back home. And Canada does not turn out to be the safe and fair place that they thought it was going to be.
I think a lot about my friend Herman, who fled Venezuela, and he was a neurologist there. And the government was not being very kind to doctors and medical professionals, and he had to flee, came to Canada. And when I met him, he was working as a personal support worker at an old age home. That was the only job that he could find at the time, and trying to find a way to put his, neurologist background to use. But that became such a difficult process. And this part-time work was the only work that was really out there.
Yeah, I have heard similar stories so many times, and it's heartbreaking because you have people who are internationally educated, know exactly what they are doing. So their skill level is incredibly high, right? So they've been working in their field and they come to Canada. Sometimes they've been told either by government policies or by immigration consultants that it'll be easy, that Canada needs engineers, that Canada needs doctors. And all you have to do is, and then they arrive, and in fact, they are not able to practice in what they have trained to do and what they have worked to do. So it's often very difficult for them personally because you think about how much of your identity is tied up in being a physician or being an engineer or being able to provide for your family. And then instead, you are taking what you can get and sometimes hoping to work towards what you were doing before or ending up doing something entirely different. And so on the employer side, there is a lot that we need to do in terms of kind of making it clearer some of the myths around internationally educated professionals in particular, in terms of how they can be credentialed and what they can contribute. And then also sometimes there's issues in the recruitment and selection process in terms of transferable skills and asking questions in a way that people are allowed to shine in the way to demonstrate that they are able to make contributions, right? So you see this with many different types of professions where, like an internal HR person, they're asking the questions that they would normally ask to a Canadian trained professional in terms of project management skills or how would you address this, but they're not attuned to how somebody with a different style of training or a different background might answer the questions a little bit differently, but still have those transferable skills that they actually have a lot to contribute to the company.
Right. That's something we talk about a lot in terms of a ton of different, job interview things, but also, grad school interviews and tests that are, put out that are created by, Canadian academics or whatever. And without the perspective of somebody who's coming from a totally different place is going to answer things differently and may not do well on this test that we've constructed or this interview setup that we've created. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as an example, you think about engineers in Canada, they are really taught a lot about project management. So almost as much as they're taught about all the other engineering skills. But that's not emphasized in the same way in other countries necessarily. And so the language that somebody might use to describe the project management that they've done might be different if they haven't used the same Gantt charts or the same technical jargon. But meanwhile, they have managed projects, right? Because they built some bridges and stuff like that. So what's needed on the company side is just to be attuned to some of those subtle differences where just to make sure that somebody is given an adequate chance to be able to explain what they're doing. And then at the same time, sometimes there's applicant tracking software it's powered by AI. And so they are especially looking for things that match the current employees at the company.
Right.
And that it's trained on those current, and so it's not noticing people with a slightly different background who look different, but have all those transferable skills that would be able to do exactly that job. Just as an example, Ontario is now emphasizing nuclear power, and they will be hiring lots of people with experience in nuclear power. Not every other country has nuclear reactors, and so those engineers are not going to have experience with nuclear, but they will have very relevant experience in other types of power generation and mechanical engineering and electrical engineering and you name it. So completely transferable, but it's going to miss a lot of the keywords that the ATS, this AI-powered applicant tracking system just doesn't, it's not going to recognize it.
Right. I remember a story a little while ago of, an AI that collected all the best attributes of all the employees at a company so that it could, spit out this is how you find the ultimate employee right? And it was something like, okay, well, they have to be 6'1", they need to have played lacrosse in high school, and they need to be named Julian or whatever it was, right? It's sort of a nonsense thing in the end, right? But this is, I think this is something that we're getting away from that one-on-one personal, looking over things. And I imagine that is connected in a lot of ways to the way that work has shifted in that direction too, right?
Yeah. So, humans are also biased. Humans might also prefer the guy who played lacrosse and he's tall, right? But we have processes in place to have checks on those and make sure that human biases don't just run away with it and hire a bunch of mini-me's who are exactly like the hiring manager. And so the issue with AI is it's this real black box. And sometimes people assume it's more objective because it's the computer deciding. But the way AI works is it's just baking in all the decisions that were made previously. So if previously there were some biases baked into the system AI is just going to recreate that, but with the stamp of computer approved. And so people are maybe less inclined to question it.
Yeah, I'm wondering too about other types of temporary foreign workers, right? The people who come to Canada and work in agriculture, pick fruit on farms. And I don't know if conditions have improved any since Stompin' Tom sang about Tilsonburg way back in the day. But, you know, it strikes me that that's an incredibly tough job with poor working conditions and incredible job insecurity at the end, right? I mean, at the end of it, often you get sent back to wherever you came from to do the work in the first place, right?
Yeah, so I think the song goes, Tilsonburg, Tilsonburg, my back still aches when I hear that word.
That's the one, yes.
Yeah, I think he wrote that song a long time ago, but I don't know how much has changed. And some of the workers I spoke to were involved in the tobacco industry, so picking, and they were lacking safety equipment, they were lacking safety training, and there was always the threat that if you didn't do what you were asked to do, then you would be sent home. So it's a precarious job, like no matter how well things are working, even though there is oversight, even though there's an ombudsperson, even though this is like a government to government initiative, it's bilateral between Canada and over a dozen different other countries. Like it's regulated. And yet I still spoke to so many people who were told, like, you have to stay on this farm. You are not allowed to leave this place. If you leave, I'm going to send you back to Mexico. So they were not incarcerated, but they were physically restrained from being able to leave this spot. It's something that no Canadian worker would ever accept. They wouldn't expect it. They wouldn't accept it. And it would be considered completely egregious. But it's something that we just anticipate that it would be fine for these other workers to have. And same with the housing. The housing conditions are often crowded. There's not enough space or privacy. We saw this during COVID, where people were getting sick very easily because the living conditions were so unacceptable. But I mean, it's not every employer. So there are so many examples of workers who come back to Canada every year for 40 years.
Right.
They have a good experience. They are treated with respect and fairly, and they are highly skilled in what they do, and the farmer respects that and provides good working conditions. But I also spoke to some agricultural business owners where they did not respect their workers at all, that they expected people to obey them unquestioningly, and they were disappointed they couldn't house their workers in the granary. And I had to look up what a granary was, but that's where you store your grain. That's not even where the animals live. And he absolutely wanted to be able to put his workers in his granary for the housing. And it was nothing I ever expected to hear in Canada.
No kidding. It was kind of heartbreaking to hear people talk like that. But I wonder, we're talking about, we can sort of educate employers about skilled workers, and, here's how you can frame an interview or alter your algorithm a little to be able to attract those skilled workers who can fill those jobs. But how do you reach an employer like that who, it seems clear, is employing these people because of a belief that they can exploit those people, right? It is by nature an exploitative hiring process in the first place. How do we reach that person?
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think you don't, honestly. I think just from my conversations with them, like, they did not believe that people should have rights in Canada until they had been in the country for generations, right? Like, it was so far beyond what, as a society, we have decided is fair. That's where the government needs to have a stronger role in auditing, so finding what's going on, and then enforcing employment standards. And it's interesting to me because in IO Psych, like we talk about kind of things like abusive supervision. And if you look at the items, it's just like, did you take credit for somebody's work? And it's like,
Right.
okay, that is bad. That, like, I agree. Don't do that. But there's things going on that's so egregiously above and beyond that it's just beyond the pale.
Right. I mean, it's straight up abuse at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And I saw that you were talking a little bit about isolation, right? Social isolation. And certainly in that circumstance, right, you have a temporary foreign worker who's come here to Canada to work on a farm, maybe with livestock or whatever, but they're isolated by virtue of the fact that they've been told they can't even leave that farm, that they're stuck there. So they're isolated from the rest of Canada, from their own families as well. Talk to me a little bit about the role isolation plays in contingent workers' experiences.
Yeah, so it's interesting because absolutely it would happen with the farm workers, especially if they had started to mention that, oh, I think this might be unsafe to use this chemical in this enclosed space. If they ever pushed back, then they were separated from the other workers so that the other workers didn't get ideas about trying to protect their safety. Same thing with restaurant workers. So I spoke to employers who were very proud of the fact that they provided housing for all their workers and that they would pick them up in the morning, bring them to the restaurant, they would work their shift, and then at the end of all their shifts, then they'd be driven right back home. Mm-hmm. They were not allowed to participate in society, right? They could not attend religious services. They couldn't make friends. They couldn't join a volleyball team, like nothing, right?
Right.
So they were just separated from everybody else. And also live-in caregivers. So people who have nannies or somebody looking after an elderly parent, very similar in that some families were delighted that the nanny might know other nannies, could arrange play dates for the children, and just have kind of great social connections. Happy nanny is happy looking after your happy children. Great.
Right.
But others would really take effort to make sure that the nanny did not meet other nannies and was kept separate and didn't get ideas about what they should be receiving or how they should be treated by the family, where they would just be kept separate. And so, yeah. And then even aside from the temporary foreign worker program, you see this sometimes with direct hire temporary workers where they have a different badge and they're maybe not allowed to have like the same breaks as the permanent employees. They're kind of kept separately.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And so I think it's part of this kind of moral disengagement on the part of some employers where it's like, okay, I'll treat my real workers well, but the others, they are other. And so that justifies me treating them less well. And it's a way of kind of separating them out and then morally justifying the behaviors that they're doing.
I get the sense, and I don't know, tell me if this makes sense to you, but I get the sense that a corporate structure, generally speaking, is inclined to move in the direction of separating people in a way that you have to make an intentional decision to do the opposite if you are somebody who's building this corporate structure, right? I'm thinking about things like, nobody discusses salary with each other because then you might know what other people make and you might be upset with us or something, right? That kind of thing. That there's a natural progression toward that in a corporate setting. Am I making any sense?
It really depends. So I found some small employers who were just amazing in terms of they bent over backwards. They really did everything they could to treat everybody really incredibly well. And also some small employers who were just horrifyingly bad in terms of, yeah. And then same thing with the big companies. So there were some big companies who would not even allow their temporary foreign workers to talk to HR. that they forced them to talk to an agency instead, and they had to pay to talk to the agency. And I think the agency was somebody's brother-in-law. Like, it was just so corrupt. It was just ridiculous. But then meanwhile, other big companies, they would work with community settlement agencies, like charitable organizations or nonprofit organizations, and bring them in to talk to all the workers and make sure they knew how to get a library card and how to use the local bus system. And like, they just went above and beyond to try to not be corporate, right? To try to be as inclusive as possible. So I feel like there are people in either organization that are just making some very clear, definite decisions of this is how we want to be, either amazing or terrible. And none of it is spontaneous. It's all like a series of decisions that reinforce each other to either really protect people or completely exploit them.
I like the example of, getting someone a library card and navigating the local bus system and things that we may not think about off the top of our head, but that are so important for people who are just showing up in that area who don't know how any of that works. We have just a few minutes left. I'm hoping we can close just by, you're talking to a company that wants to be a responsible citizen, that wants to be profitable and wants to be able to, continually bring in workers who are going to be helpful to them, and they can be helpful to those workers. What do you say to them? How do you suggest that they go about it?
So if they wanted to, they can contact me. I'd be happy to talk to them at length about any of this. But I think the best and most important thing to start is to change the frame about how they are seeing these workers. So don't see them as separate and other. See them as proto-permanent employees. So they're not permanent now, but in the future, they could be. So these temporary foreign workers, they're not foreigners, they are future citizens, likely.
Right.
And this supply teacher who you've hired as a maternity leave replacement, she's not a supply, she is a future permanent teacher, possibly at your school. And this factory worker that you hired through an agency, okay, they're not an agency worker. They are in the future possibly going to be your best permanent employee, maybe even a manager.
A reframing of the way we view temporary workers, gig workers, and contingent workers of all kinds will go a long way toward promoting the human rights of all Canadians and all those who visit here to make their lives and our lives better. My thanks to Dr. Catherine Connelly for joining me today, and to you at home for listening, streaming, and downloading today's episode. You can find links to Dr. Connelly's lab and to the Stompin' Tom song Tilsonburg in today's show notes. Mindful is written, hosted, and published by me, Eric Bowman. Our producer, editor, and in this case, contingent worker is Jamie Montgomery, and our theme music is Avenues by Canadian musician and contributor to the gig economy, David Taylor.